Welcome to the Technology, Risk and Gambling Seminar Series. This is a pre-recorded seminar, so you won't be able to ask any questions, unfortunately, of our panelists, but please feel free to chat if you're watching live for the other people who are tuning in. So I'm really excited about this one to have two guests. So I have Sarah Ramanauskas and Simo Dragicevic, who are co-founders of the Safer Gambling Initiative, and they are going to talk to us about player safety, product safety, but also draw on their experiences from beyond the gaming and gambling field, which I think is really relevant. So, Simo, I'll start with you because I've known you for the longest. And one thing I've been starting with this season is to ask our panelists how you describe yourself when you're meeting new people.
Oh, right. Okay. The industry, I'd describe myself as a founder because that's what I'm trying to do, I guess. New sort of products and services that sort of can make the industry a little bit more sustainable and keeps gambling as entertainment. So yeah, that's how I would start, and then I would probably go into a little bit more detail about what that means. So yeah, no, I started getting back in 2009. I used to work in financial services, and I founded a company called BetBuddy, which was one of the first to look at using player data and machine learning to try and find interesting patterns of play, predict risky behavior, and try and integrate that into the sort of daily processes of gambling operators. Yeah, the BetBuddy was eventually product market fit became quite strong in the UK and other jurisdictions. We were acquired by a large supplier called Playtech, and I was there for a few years. And since then, I've moved on. I do a couple of advisory roles with the RGC, and they're on their board, also with the regulator in the UK, the Gambling Commission on one of their advisory boards. And I'm here today with co-founder Sarah of GSI. So yeah, that's how I would probably introduce myself, Sally.
And Sarah?
Well, I guess, yeah, now thanks to the work that I'm doing with Seymour, I can also describe myself as a founder, which sounds very grand, but I don't think I quite live up to that title just yet. I guess normally I would describe myself as someone who's been working with the gambling industry now for about the last 10 years, basically nagging them to improve player protection. My background is in market research, it's in consumer data. I kind of fell into gambling by mistake when I was recruited to run the research team at Betfair here in the UK. About, oh my goodness, 14 years ago now. So I guess my kind of the way I work with Seymour and add to what Seymour does is that I see gamblers as people rather than gamblers. I think there's far too much in the industry of saying, oh, well, they're a gambler, and associating specific behavior with them because they're gamblers. Whereas what I do is I think of them as people. And I think that's what the Game Safety Institute is really starting to do, is to say, well, we've got these gambling products, but they're being used by people. And how can we use that understanding of people in general, rather than this specific idea of a gambler, to make gambling, the activity, safer for everybody?
Oh, and that's something we're definitely going to get into. But I'm curious because as a founder, which is a great grant title, there are lots of different fields, so many different areas. You both have really varied backgrounds. How do you think you ended up in gambling, or what more to the point, what drove you both to decide to stay in gambling as a field in which you're going to sort of really concentrate your efforts?
Well, I mean, I think it's actually quite difficult to get out once you're in. But I mean, really, certainly for me, over the last 10 years when I've been working in the safer gambling space, there's just so much to do, Sally. There is so much work that needs to be done. I mean, literally every day I open up one of my gambling newsletters and there's a new product that's completely different to anything else. I'm like, okay, how does that work and what's the impact going to be? Or there's a whole new country that's decided to legalize gambling. You think, well, what is happening there? How is that whole new group of people being protected? So I think, yeah, I mean, I'm still here because there's just so much to do. But also, I think because it's interesting, and as a market researcher, or to put it another way, as someone who's really nosy, I love trying to understand, well, what's going on? What is happening? What are the real motivations behind that behavior? And then how can we best advise someone about the behavior and why that might be risky? So rather than, pointing fingers, going, actually, this is a good way to protect yourself. So I think that's kind of the challenge that Seymour and I have taken on, is how do we get people to appreciate that what they're doing might be addictive and might be risky, but without going, oh, you might have a problem, and all of that sort of stigmatizing language that's been built up over the last however many years. So there's just so much to do.
Yeah, and that's definitely my sort of my perspective, coming from psychology and starting before I was even in the field of working in bars and pubs and seeing people gamble and thinking, that's odd to put that much money into a machine, and leave with nothing. That's what's behind, what's driving the intrinsic drivers and the emotions, and what's led that person to be here today. That kind of consumer focused understanding, which I think is relatively new to the gambling field. There has been a real focus on, consumer being responsible as opposed to consumers interacting with the product. And Simo, you've come with your expertise in data analysis and had a brief stint with the industry. I mean, how does your perspective on looking at this all?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I sort of, how did I get into the industry? I came in via, I guess, financial services, and at the time, it was going through a really difficult phase. Financial services, you had the global financial crisis, a lot of questionable behavior in investment banks, sort of concept of moral hazard, were people taking risks with other people's money, and there's no downside if you're a trader. Oh, I'm going to trade this money, and if I get my bet right, I make tons of money in my bonuses. If I get it wrong, well, the bank just loses the money. And then that crept into wider sort of investigations into how the retail industry sold its products and services to consumers, and the industry was really under the cosh. And I felt that the gambling industry had this wave coming. It was a little bit behind financial services, but it was a bit of intuition at the time. As a founder, you have to make these sort of punches, and you try to be as grounded as you can. And it was like, well, it feels inevitable that this kind of focus on the consumer, treating customers fairly, all that kind of stuff will eventually sort of land in the gambling industry. And it did. It's taken a lot of time, I have to say. It took a lot longer than I thought. But yeah, no, that's and answering your question, but why do you stay in? I guess Sarah's right. It's hard to leave the industry when you've dedicated so much time and effort over the years to try and help solve these problems. You become probably most useful as an individual in this industry solving these problems, and it's probably why I'm trying to do more in this space, is because that's probably the best use of my sort of experience and expertise, and how best I can be useful in this world. I could try and start again in my early 50s in another industry, but that's actually quite hard, because it's quite hard to make a name for yourself in a new industry, as I did in the gambling industry. That took a lot of tenacity and hard work. But I think you were asking about, sorry, what was the question around data and Sally as well? Did you touch on that?
Your perspective is slightly different. Sarah, coming from like a marketing consumer understanding, and I'm from psychology. You know, you've come through from a different perspective.
Yeah, no, and I guess there's a few, and again, I took a big interest in technology in the noughties, and there were a lot of tech mega happening. There was mobile happening. There was first wave of machine learning. There was things like cloud computing. All these things were having a really sort of big, profound impact on lots of industries. So that was a kind of an exciting time to try and sort of build a business that can sort of capitalize on these sort of tech mega trends. The trends in the industry, such as the uptick of online and registered play, but also the much more cheaper availability of computing resources, internet making it possible to hire people all over the world at much lower rates, easier to develop products that are, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a lot of kind of interest. It was an interesting time to try and be a founder and in the tech space and the gambling space. And those trends have actually sort of continued even more over the years. So and that's what makes it interesting. You've had a lot more tech companies try and develop sort of solutions game space in the sort of what I'd say the KYC, AML, RG compliance kind of area. Yeah, no, I definitely come from a different perspective, and that does make it interesting working with Sarah, who has a very wired mind to mine. We look at, even though sort of philosophically we're on the same page and we're going in that same direction, we do look at problems differently and different perspectives, and that's always useful, having different perspectives, experiences to try and solve problems. And that's hopefully what you get if you sort of work with us, is you get one gray hair, Sarah not so much, who've seen quite a few things and can help try and apply that expertise and knowledge to try and solve these, which are really thorny issues. And as we know in the gambling industry, these are very, very sensitive, thorny, complex problems. Is this the balance between sort of running a commercial enterprise in the gambling industry and protecting consumers?
Yeah, and I'm keen to get into that. You both have backgrounds in finance and other areas. I know, Sarah, you've worked in lots of different industries. Are there comparable products which are risky but have an emphasis on consumers being the ones that have to take responsibility for the safety versus, industry and government regulations? Is gambling similar or unique to other industries in the sense of where the balance sits across those different levels of responsibility and the safeguards are automatically put in place?
Yeah, so I think we could probably talk all day about the various parallels, but the one that I'm using a lot at the moment is actually the automotive industry, because what we're trying to do with game safety is really flip the lens and say, at the moment, safer gambling is all about the individual, and it asks the individual to take action against potential risk. So the example in the automotive industry is you put your seatbelt on, you take a specific action, right? Or if you're a cyclist, because there are dangerous cars out there, you put a helmet on, you make that action to keep yourself safe. But, as Simo has been talking about, technology from a computing perspective, that computing technology is now available in cars. And what the automotive industry is doing is it is putting things into cars, which means you are just safer. It's the product. The product is becoming safer. But that's a whole combination of things. It's partly competitive advantage. Volvo have been doing these things for years, and they use that as a competitive advantage. And we're trying to say to the gambling industry, keeping your players safer by changing your product will make you more competitive. I think we're at the beginning of that journey at the moment. The other thing that has really changed the safety of someone who is on the road is regulation. So Sally and I met at EASG, and Sally was talking about how now she goes out on her bike, she always puts a bike helmet on. I used to put a bike helmet on, but now in London, I don't. I don't take that personal action anymore to keep myself safe because the environment has changed. For example, there's a whole load more bike lanes that are completely separate from cars. So you're totally safe. You don't have to do anything. You just have to take that bike lane. Also, they've changed the highway code. So as a cyclist, I now have priority over cars. How cool is that? But that's the law. And again, I think, what we want to do at Game Safety is work with the regulators and say, how can we make the product and the environment safer for people? So I think from using the automotive industry as an example, what we're trying to say is, let's move the focus away from trying to get someone who is gambling to exhibit behaviors that actually they don't want to exhibit, do things that they're actually really not very interested in and that they don't think apply to them, and actually just help them to gamble in a safer environment with safer products.
Yeah, I mean, that's super interesting. The automotive industry, like it's just become standard to have really cool features, lane assist, blind spot assist, adaptive control, because it's kind of, I think they're all really useful features. And then, this grows up, this becomes pervasive and it just makes the roads a bit safer. And I mean, from my background in financial services, it's an interesting industry, and there are some parallels with gambling. I mean, they're not exact like for likes, but they're the useful case studies. And if we think about product safety and financial services, for sure in the UK, the financial institutions are compelled to make sure that the products are designed to meet the needs of the customers. And if you go into some of the more exotic products, some of the derivatives that retail customers buy and not the non-standard financial instruments, there are even stronger restrictions and laws. I think in the EU it's called MiFID is the acronym, or MiFID 2 is the next phase of it, where whoever develops the products, they can really understand the characteristics of the product. They need to understand who the target market is for the product. It's going to meet their needs, and that the person who does purchase the product understands what they're purchasing and why they're purchasing it, and also who the product is not designed for as well. So this is now baked in regulations, and it's very interesting because, okay, gambling is not investing, but there's such a range of products, and as Sarah was saying earlier, we think about the gambler as an individual, as a person, we're all unique and different, and we all have different motivations and needs and wants. Why am I? What is my entertainment objective, if that's what it is, and what are the products suitable, and are they being distributed to me in a responsible manner? Am I seeing the products that are best designed to meet my needs? So I don't think the industry is very good at doing this, and it wouldn't surprise me if some of these elements of regulation in financial services begin to become more pervasive with sort of progressive regulators. So, hang on a minute, there are 20,000 slots available in this market, and actually there's a huge amount of variety in them. Are they designed to meet the needs of the consumer? And I can talk a lot about this, but I think financial services is a really useful barometer in terms of what's happened, how the regulations have been, what are the expectations.
Yeah, and there's so much there to look into, because regulation might be availability, how many machines, and I say that coming from New South Wales, which has 90,000 machines, jurisdiction that is, geographically, definitely population wise, that's a lot of machines per person. You know, the availability, how many, where are they, hours of operations, all of that kind of stuff versus, you know, the actual product. So does the product itself need to be different? So, you know, what do you think are some of the important levers that should be, where do you think are the, I guess, the easy wins, or where do you think are the really critical things that need to change ultimately to make something safer or appropriate? Do you think there's products we have in existence that are just not appropriate, that need to be either banned or fundamentally changed?
Yes.
It's an interesting question. I think from my perspective, I like the idea of choice. I like the philosophy that there are, you know, having a variety of choice for consumer is good. And then we can get into other topics here, Sally. We can get into why choice is good, because you have other issues to solve, like the illegal market. So if you reduce choice in the regulated market, remove some elements that are attractive to some, you know, types of players, does it compel them to look for that in another place where the broader protections for themselves, their finances are not there? So again, this is what makes it such a complex area. It touches upon so many different elements, and you can't just look at it in isolation. So I think specifically, I like the idea of choice and having a range of games and features and modes and functionality, but putting that blindly out there for all players to sort of freely consume. If their education levels are pretty low, they don't understand what they're getting into, and if they can quickly lose their money without realizing, I think that then that's when you get into problems, and that's when you get into situations where these sort of features are banned because the industry's kind of just put them out there and assumed they're right for all, where actually there are some players who they're perfect good products for, but others they're not, and that's where we're trying to, I guess, help the industry do a little bit of navel gazing and say, look, you know, if you're careful and strategic and thoughtful about this, you know, eventually all these things that a subset of your value players like and consume safely and within their means are just going to be banned, and then you have another issue, which you're losing players to an illegal market, and that is another issue for a regulator as well, and it has all these other consequences. So that's where I sort of stand. We could get into some details around things that, you know, probably shouldn't be there, but that's I guess a starting point.
Yeah, I think for me, the biggest issue is that players are being fooled. So, you know, we're looking at what are the risks of online slots, for example. And if you read a lot of the academic research, much of which Sally has done some great work in, there are two elements. There's the dissociation, which is, you know, I'm just involved in this game and I'm in the zone. But the other one that's really concerning to me is the masking of financial risk. I do a lot of work in the US with US state lotteries. And as part of that, I always sort of point out to them the low levels of numeracy that exist in their individual states. You know, people simply don't have the tools necessary to understand the risk of the game that they're playing. And that risk is firstly, it's masked by advertising and jackpots. You know, win $20,000. Yes, but what's the likelihood of that? It's absolutely tiny, and people do not understand that probability. So you've got the marketing, which is telling you that you can win this money, but also then when you're playing the game, your losses are not apparent to you. And I think that's something that I think should really be looked at through regulation. How can we make the game and the risk of the game much clearer to players? And if you have the patience to read the 140 pages of the new Brazilian regulations, they do have some really, sorry, that's my husband. Just a minute. Thank you. Sorry. He promised me he would be quiet, but there you go. He's desperate for another coffee. It's because it's now 7:30. It's time for a second coffee. So I think there's so much that needs to be done to understand what actually is this sort of vulnerable population of people who simply are not numerate. You know, and Simo will talk to this as well, I'm sure. This is what the financial services industry suddenly woke up to. It's like people really don't understand what they're getting into. They're bamboozled with the sales and marketing and advertising, and then they sign something that they don't understand, and they are sold something that is not appropriate for them. And I think that is something that we, again, the gambling industry and the regulators of the gambling industry really need to work harder on.
Yeah, and I know you're both, well, Simo, you're going to be at the IAGA, the International Association for Gambling Regulators Conference, in a couple of weeks. So, you know, and you mentioned Brazil, Sarah. I'm keen to know from both of you, are there any examples of really strong regulations that you do know of? And, you know, feel free to cherry pick from place A and place B, but where would you see, what are your recommendations if there was a brand new, you know, jurisdiction looking to regulate? We could start with, you know, slot machines, for example, or you could talk about online gambling. Are there any guiding principles that are on your must-have lists?
I mean, good question. I mean, the UK is often referred to as sort of a high standard gambling regulation, and some jurisdictions do copy a lot of what the UK does. I know that in Canada and Ontario, a lot of what was implemented in the UK was implemented there as well. So, but I wouldn't say it was perfect. And look, you know, I am an advisor to the UK regulator. They're doing some, you know, really important and groundbreaking work to try and modernize and improve the way they regulate the industry. So I'm a big supporter of everything they're doing, but I think it's such a complex area. It's very hard to sort of say that this is the sort of the benchmark, because I think it's fair to say a lot of regulation happens based on intuition or incomplete evidence, and that's not a criticism. It's just a fact of life, isn't it? You know, you try to do what's best, and some of the in the UK, you know, and I think the regulator will be honest about this. You know, the evidence base isn't quite there, but they've kind of had to. They've been forced, or they're under pressure to keep moving the and raising standards, and so they have to make decisions based on that incomplete evidence. And there's a lot of reasons why the evidence is incomplete. We'll get into that, I'm sure, especially around product safety. But I think UK is trying to get the right balance. There's a lot of debate at the moment with its white paper and whether it's going too far in certain places. But again, I'm from the UK. I know the industry here and the regulators can do well. I feel they're trying to do it the right way, but inevitably they're going to make some mistakes.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I think the Brazil regulations do look like they are trying to ensure that if you are playing an online game, even like they even mentioned crash games, which I think probably most people in the industry don't even know what they were. I didn't know what they were until Seymour told me about them about a year ago. But apparently they are huge in Africa because they're very, very simple to play on a mobile phone. So Brazil is addressing crash games, nobody else is. So I think what I see in regulation is that all the time they're sort of running to try and keep up with the innovation in the industry. But the other thing that I find is that the industry has a lot of power over regulators. I think too much power often. And regulators themselves come from a background that isn't necessarily gambling. They might have come from alcohol or tobacco. They don't understand gambling. And so I'll give you for example, in Ontario, the regulation says that no operator can offer a bonus in their advertising. So you can't have a new customer join now and get $30 free as an ad. And the regulator kind of went, isn't that great? We've banned this. I'm like, well, of course, because of course the gambling industry are very happy to accept that, because that brings down their cost of acquisition. Whereas then if you go onto the OLG casino site, which is the Ontario Lotteries casino site, there's this great big new customer bonus offer. So it's there, but it's just, you know, it's not within advertising. And I think that's what I see a lot of the time, is that the regulators are either influenced by the industry or don't have enough industry experience themselves. And I agree with Seymour. I think, you know, our UK Gambling Commission has now been around long enough that that it's really getting it right in a number of areas. If you look at, say, for example, the Dutch and the KSA in the Netherlands, they don't really seem to know what they're doing, because they're getting so much political pressure. So the politicians are saying, you got to protect people more, you got to protect people more. And it just seems like, you know, again, every day I open up my gambling newsletters, there's something new from Netherlands. Oh, we're now increasing the, you know, the requirements on the operator for duty of care. So I think I think IAGA is going to be a very interesting time for Seymour to really take the temperature of what's going on, and what are the real pressures that regulators are feeling at the moment when they're trying to keep up with technology. They've got all of this political pressure. You know, the gambling industry is trying to influence them as well. It's a difficult job, I have to say.
And it's interesting. I mean, product safety is outlined as an evidence by the UK or the Great British regulator. We call it the UKGC, but it's technically the Great Britain Gambling Commission. So I should really use the right terminology there, the GBGC. But yeah, product safety is an evidence gap, and IAGA is going to be interesting, because I wanted to use it as an opportunity to try and work with regulators. Look, there is an evidence gap here. You know, you're having to try and regulate an increasingly complex, fast-moving industry, get more complex. You know, crash games is a really good example. A really interesting sort of slant on slots that are not really slots, but have a lot of the slots kind of mechanics, and grew at a popularity in crypto casinos because they're not regulated and they have very high RTPs, because it's cheaper to run a crypto casino than it is to, say, run a casino regulated in somewhere like the UK or the Netherlands. The compliance costs are much lower. So they can actually offer these very attractive games that pay back more in the long run, and they've actually developed these more sort of simplistic games. And I think we could do a whole set on crash games. I did a presentation on these a few months ago, which was super interesting. But yeah, there is this gap, and I think regulators need help to try and understand, how do we fill these gaps? You know, where are the gaps in evidence? Where are the priorities? And sort of product. Most of the focus in regulation since I've been in the gambling industry has been on the player and understanding who the individual is, you know, what are their circumstances, how do they gamble, what are their patterns of play. If you look at all the regulations in the UK and other jurisdictions, starting off with player tooling, self-exclusion, then we sort of went into things like player analytics using data, then we had centralized self-exclusion, then we have single custody view. Now we have affordability and financial risk check. It's all focused on the player, and not much has been focused on the product. And I'm sort of interested in your thoughts on that, because I kind of feel that the product is such a sensitive area for the industry that, you know, Sarah's comments earlier around the influence of the industry being quite strong. I can be quite cynical, and when I look at, say, North America or the US, a lot of the industry funding of research has gone to things like understanding the brain, understanding the player, and understanding action. And until recently, that's been the focus. And I feel is it fair to say, strategic or deliberate? But I do see. I'm interested in your thoughts on that, Sally.
I mean, it is true. There's a lack of research on play features and product. And I do think there's a number of reasons for that. One is definitely a stalling or a tactic that it's very hard to regulate a strong change in product without comprehensive evidence. So it's this sort of loop factor of, oh, well, we're not sure. There's a conversation at the moment I'm involved in about opening hours. You know, what is the appropriate opening hours at the moment in New South Wales? There's a shutdown that's kind of between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m., except if you're exempt. And so there are some venues with different shutdowns. So, you know, people move between venues, so it's not really effective. And should the shutdown be at 12 or should it be at 2, you know? And it's really hard to say because there's not very strong evidence. And I think that's the same for, I mean, I remember in the 90s, Mark Griffiths did this teeny tiny little study, no offense, Mark, on like lights and sounds, and people say, oh, it's the lights and sounds. Like, yeah, maybe, and that's certainly part of it. But, you know, there's this one study from the 90s with some fruit machine players. It's hardly, you know, comprehensive evidence. So I think one of the limitations is it's really hard to study. Unlike something like alcohol or, you know, automobiles, you can't study a gambling product in a gambling environment without the industry and the regulators' approval and direct support. So there are, like, it's a really tricky thing to do independently. It's impossible, essentially. And there's a real lack of willingness for this research to actually be done. So some of it is just the pragmatics of the research, but certainly you're right. The funding of the research has been on, you know, on aspects of the player. You know, what are the risk factors? How can we provide education tools? And I say this as someone who's done this research in addition to, you know, starting off looking at, well, how can we do warning messages and alter the products so the warnings are more prominent? But it's fundamentally very, very difficult to research the product to demonstrate the impact of one versus another. The consumers aren't really that thrilled about it either, to be perfectly honest. So I think that there needs to be a higher appetite. When we were at, Sarah and I were at the European Gambling Conference last week, and saw some great presentations by operators in some of the Nordic and Scandinavian countries. You know, Finland and Norway are doing some amazing research because the operators are the ones doing the research. They're doing A/B testing. You know, if we call customers based on this metric, or if we notify people at this point, the operators are the ones doing the research, and they're altering their product in such a way they can evaluate what works. And I don't know how to do the research. I mean, I'm keen to hear from you if there are ways to do the research without. I can't understand how you could do it without the operators, really. So we really have to get the operators on board and the regulators, because the regulators usually have to approve changes to the product.
No, 100%, Sally. You can't do this in isolation. And I think there was a lot of criticism, some of the product focused research in the past, the lab-based, where, you know, all good intentions of researchers that try and recreate a slot machine, put it in a lab, give some sort of undergrads a bit of pretend money, you know, spin this really simple, you know, 1 line 3 euro reel of, like, you know, sevens and bells and cherries, and let's monitor how you respond if you get a near miss or if you win. But you know, that you know, we know that that's is very imperfect. But I guess with online, you know, you do have the availability to capture data, not just around the player, but increasingly around the product. You know, some of the headline maths and detailed maths around the product is what we're looking at. If you can combine that with the player, and because it's online, you can do some really interesting sort of real world experiments. And you know, we did a couple of those at Playtech, which were very interesting. Far from conclusive, but very interesting, that you can begin to spot interesting insights that can inform research further down the line. And I think that it's possible, but there needs to be some guidance as to how you do this, and where to start, and what data is required, and what are the sort of building blocks you need in place in order to start filling those evidence gaps. And I'm very keen to help, and you know that, to try and sort of assist in coming up with that framework for how you tackle those gaps. And it needs to be quite systematic. There needs to be sort of consistent understanding of what the industry is, what the products are, we need to know what's been done to date, what we've learned, because there has been research. We do need to build on that. And we need to sort of factor in those technological and industry trends. Where's the innovation happening? Where's the growth in products? What are we seeing? What are people playing? There's no, for example, trying to fill an evidence gap in an area of decline. If there's, a type of product or service or placement that, is not going to grow in the future. So lots of considerations for sure.
Yeah, and I think I'm not actually going to add to that exactly. I think we should do more to try and understand what it is that is attractive about a game, but from outside of the gambling industry. So there's like one paper, I think, that looks at why people like playing the games that have things like cards and jewels. And what those are is they're little sort of pixelated representations of something that is real. Yeah. And I think there's a lot of potential in thinking about how can we look at the way in which people understand the world and interact in particular with their mobile phones to try and understand what it is about, for example, an online slot that keeps people playing. Because Simo is doing some amazing work in understanding, well, it's there's the maths behind it. How often do you get a reward? All of that sort of, random variation of reward that's going on. But I'm also really interested in Starburst. Starburst is the most played slot anywhere all the time, pretty much. It's really, really popular because it's really, really simple. What is it about that simplicity that holds people in and continues to get them to spend money? Because I think that's also another fascinating aspect. I completely agree with you, Sally. When I first joined Betfair, it took me months to get my head around this. Someone's placed £500 on a horse race. £500, that was quite a lot of money to me by then. £500, and they don't get anything. They just lose, and they just lose it. They don't get anything for it. It was just really weird. If you spend £500 on a dinner, for example, you still had dinner. So I think, yes, what is it that attracts people to these games that is something that is more generally understood from other areas of behavioral science, from financial services, from looking at the way in which people are using their mobile phones, internet addiction. I think there's lots and lots of areas where we can start again, as we've been saying, thinking about gamblers as people. Where else are these people, and how can we understand better from their behavior in other places in order to keep them safe when they're exhibiting gambling behavior in particular?
I think that's so important, because we do get really focused in the gambling field, or what's the evidence for gambling, for gambling policies. But a lot of these mechanics are similar that we see in other fields where there is some research and evidence, or regulation is going in place even in lieu of evidence. So things like social media and social gaming, we know that regulators are starting to push down and push back. In Australia, there's a conversation about banning social media for people under the age of 16, not based on, empirical studies that have isolated and done randomized controlled trials, but just based on the fact that mental health is in massive decline, and it seems pretty clear social media is making a pretty strong contribution to that. So there is this ability to regulators to do things, with enough will behind them. So I think that's really an important premise to keep in mind, that we can borrow that if we strip back down and look at the mechanics of action and the behavioral economics and the human biases that people are acting in, we don't have to have evidence on, on a specific slot product. We can look at how people behave and what we would infer from this, and that can inform regulation. I'm aware we're sort of running out of time. I want to really put you guys on the hot seat a little bit more and press, because we're not in front of a live audience, and it's fun. You guys are pretty up for the challenge. In discussion, you're in the context of we're aware there's not sufficient evidence. I still want to push you both to tell me, where would you like to see more regulation? If you could press for and recommend changes to enhance product safety, what are the bike lanes of the gambling industry?
Well, where would I press for more regulation? That's a tough one. I would for sure try and put the onus on transparency around product and features on the industry a little bit more. So if you think about what the industry they can focus on education, they can focus on control, they can focus on restrictions. So the easiest one is education because it's the softest one. So absolutely, if you're, for example, offer ranges in coin sizes or stakes, start with the default, which is the lowest, things like that. You still have the option to stake up, but why would you put it at the highest or what you think is optimal? If you're going to offer features that speed up play, tell people the consequences, whether it's turbo play, whether it's auto play, etc. If you're going to offer features that allow you to increase your stake, like buyer, and then this is mainly around slots at the moment. If you're going to sort of buy skip the base game of a slot, go straight into the bonus round, but you've got to up your stake from, say, 50 cents to $5. It should be like, the game is still, the RTP is broadly very much going to be the same. What you're doing is just pressing your play into a much sort of shorter stint, and you're paying to get into that round. You would have got to the same place before. That probably wasn't a very eloquent definition, but there's much that I think we need to do around transparency, around all these sort of features that are increasingly confusing. That
You're still putting the emphasis on the player, though. Like, you can inform the player, but the player has to read that information and then make an inference from that information.
True. That's a good challenge, Sally. What if you had a very simple option when you play a game is to press safe mode? So it's going to go to the lowest default. It's going to switch off buy features. It's going to switch off autoplay. It's going to switch off in-game marketing. So when your balance reaches zero, you're not going to get a pop-up saying deposit again. Something like that. So you're basically saying play it in this mode, and if you then want to sort of add bits on, then go for it. Or that's the default mode.
That's the default mode, but you can't call it safe mode, because that's may as well call it boring mode. You have to call it something like maximize time. So you have to put the trade-offs in front of players, talk in the language that they want, because they're players who are interested on maximum time on device. This is the way to get more bang for your buck, essentially. Like, you can eke out your money. So you've got to put it in player-centric terms. This is going to make you get, maximum time on product. And potentially, if you put on turbo play, then the requirement is you have to set yourself a limit. So you don't, spend. So you have to set, within a budget. You can play turbo play, but you have to pre-allocate, like when you're at the gas pump, you have to pre-select how much money you want to spend on gas, so the pump automatically shuts off at that time.
They're really good suggestions, Sally. Like that suggestion, sorry, Sarah, that why you should ask the player what they want to get out of this. Is it maximum advice? Like, why shouldn't I just log on to my app and say, what do you want to do? What do you want to get out of say, I've got $20 and I've got 20 minutes. I want to fill that time with, and I want to have the chance to win. But that's what I want to get out of this. That's going to give you a different range of products than what would typically lobby when I first log in, which would be probably a very high volatility slot with some funky persistence features or some other stuff that I don't probably understand. So I agree with you, but should that be regulated? I don't know how you would do that, but I think they're really good suggestions. Really good. Yeah.
I think it's very much a combination of the product and the player. And at the moment, it's all on the player, as we've been talking about. But for me, the regulations need to be almost at a much higher level, because regulation can't keep up with the changes in the product. So you've got to have a very high level of regulation that just says, basically, as Seymour said, transparency. Know what you are getting into and then make that decision. So coming back to automotive, you've got the blind spot warning lights. So, you're beebling along a highway and there might be a truck behind you that you don't really want to, move into the lane in front of the truck, but the blind spot just warns you that that truck is there. You still make that decision as to whether or not you want to move into the lane and get squished by the truck. So, there's an important combination of factors here. There's telling people what they're getting into, telling people the risk that they're about to get squished by a truck, but also giving them the autonomy to make that decision. Because what we know, if we mention the word problem just once in this webinar, which I think is probably a record for this kind of subject, what we know about people who develop a problem with gambling is that they lose control. And what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to get people to feel that they are in control, that they're not losing money too quickly, as Simo was saying, that they're having an enjoyable time, and they don't panic. They don't suddenly think, oh, I've got to deposit more money, I've got to win this money back. So that it's all about giving people transparency and real control over the games that they're playing, because they don't have that at the moment.
Yeah, and I'm a huge fan of defaults. I think that defaults provide choice. So like you were saying, Simo, starting off on, the lower denomination, having a default potentially that says, this is the maximum amount you can deposit. However, people can change it, but there's effort required, and that's fine. You can change it. That's no problem. I think it's important because most people are lazy and they don't. We see, every research study ever has basically shown that defaults are really effective in shaping behavior. But also they send a really clear message, because currently with gambling, there's no guidelines. We've had the emergence recently of the low risk gambling guidelines, but unlike something like alcohol, where people kind of know, okay, 1 or 2 drinks an hour, or even if they don't know that, they know don't drink and drive. Like that's fairly well known. So there are some guidelines, but when you come up with this idea of like play responsibly or safer gambling, there's no tangible understanding of what that means for people. So they've really got no clue. And then you might explain it and say, well, gamble what you can afford. And it's like, well, what's that? Or gamble so you feel in control. I'm like, oh, okay, like that requires a lot of ongoing monitoring. So these are really vague things. So defaults help set a really clear, so they put a stake in the ground, and they say that, the operator or the government, whoever it is, have said $100 a day, or, whatever the magic number is. And that's just signaling to people, okay, that's where they recommend. And again, you can go over that, but similarly to, having to just jump over the hoop, you're now aware you've stepped into, a riskier territory, and that act and that signposting for people and the anchoring is really important. So I'm a big proponent of putting defaults in place as part of a safer gambling strategy, because theoretically it shouldn't actually cost the industry or the government anything, because people can still increase their limits if they want, but it really helps set the tone, I think, that's aligned with what everyone's talking about, whether they're doing it or not. Everyone's saying they believe in safer gambling. Anyway, that's my little rant, but it's supposed to be you guys. I want to turn it over to you both for your end of wrap ups. Are there any kind of wish list or asks that you have of the TRG audience you want to get off your chest?
No ask, but I would say that this area of sort of product safety, I want people to really focus on it. I think there's a lot of good that can come out of it, as you say, from you can really truly say that this is an entertainment product. And if you sort of if you listen to all of the big operators, they're all talking about entertainment. It's entertainment. It's not gambling. It's an entertainment product. It's being mixed with sports and media and live shows and it's entertainment. So truly, if that's the case, then you really got to sort of look at the product and understand the consumer's needs and entertainment needs. So, you know, a much more sort of honest and close element, I think, is really needed. And I think it's good for everyone. No one wants the knee-jerk regulation, the banning of products, etc., because I think the unintended consequences, you know, are there, and you know, the illegal is real. It does exist. There are people operating in that space that won't have your best interest. So I think the focus on the product is really important. So yeah, I'm hoping that this is more conversations online, in person, at conferences, research with regulators, with operators, etc. So yeah, that's about it really.
I just have one thing to add to that, which is the gambling industry needs smart people. And I think that if you give those smart people the challenge of making products safer and actually building safety into the product, that's a really compelling story for any operator who wants to attract and retain smart, motivated people. So it's in their interest to really start thinking about this and thinking about how can they actually get their staff to get more into understanding product safety and building that in from the get-go.
Yeah, I think that's really overlooked, that idea of both customer and staff satisfaction, which is really critical. So Sarah, Simo, thank you so much. I knew it would be a fantastic conversation. It'll go way too fast. If people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way?
Simo, Simo, at safer.games, and Sarah
At
safer.games.
Games.
Simple as that.
Fantastic. And there's LinkedIn and the Safe Gaming Institute website. So it's a fantastic initiative that we're looking forward to hearing more about. So thank you both so much. And thank you to everyone who has listened. It is a great privilege to be able to host such interesting conversations with such amazing people. So thank you all, and tune in next week and continue to catch all the back episodes of the TRG on the YouTube playlist channel. Until then, bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sally. Thanks, everyone. Bye.